The air in Charleston hung thick and wet, even in October, clinging to skin like a second baptism nobody asked for. Along the Ashley River, where the marshland met cultivated earth, the Ravenshade Plantation sprawled across 300 acres of cotton fields that glowed white under the autumn sun. From a distance, it looked like heaven. Orderly rows, a grand house with columns painted brilliant white, magnolia trees framing the carriageway like sentinels of southern prosperity. Up close, it smelled like hell. The scent of rot mixed with burnt sugar from the mill hung perpetually in the air. Workers moved through the fields with heads down, backs bent, their movements synchronized not by song, but by the rhythm of survival. Every eye tracked the overseer's position, every ear strained for the crack of leather against air. At Ravenshade, silence was a language spoken fluently by those who had learned that words could cost you teeth. Edward Sinclair owned everything the eye could see from his second-story balcony, including the people who made his wealth possible. He was 43, broad-shouldered, with a face that had once been handsome before whiskey, and cruelty carved new lines into it. His father had built Ravenshade from nothing, establishing himself among Charleston's planter elite through shrewd cotton trading and strategic marriages. Edward inherited the land and the status, but none of his father's restraint. Where other planters spoke of discipline and order, Edward spoke of spectacle. He hosted gatherings where visiting masters could observe his methods, punishments designed not just to correct, but to entertain. A slave who stole food might be made to eat until vomiting. One who talked back would have his tongue held with hot tongs while onlookers sipped brandy. Edward called it maintaining order. His guests called it innovative. The enslaved called it Tuesday. The mill stood at the heart of the plantation, a massive structure of brick and timber that housed the cotton gin and grinding mechanisms powered by a water wheel fed from the river. It ran from dawn
Tell me in the
until
comments
well
which
past
country
dark
you are
during
from
harvest season,
and what you
its
thought of
rhythmic
this
churning
story.
a constant
And if
reminder
this story made
of
an
Edward's
impression
dominance
on you,
over both nature
subscribe
and
to the
man,
channel
so
you
you
had
don't miss
expanded
any
it twice,
future stories. Adding mechanisms that could process seed and bone meal alongside cotton, maximizing every possible profit from his land. It was at this mill that Malachi first understood what hatred truly meant. He was 31, tall and corded with muscle from years of forge work. His hands were scarred from hot metal and rope burns, his back a landscape of healed welts that told stories he never spoke aloud. Malachi had been born at Ravenshade, delivered by his mother in a cabin that no longer stood, raised alongside the master's children until the age when color mattered more than companionship. He learned the blacksmith trade from old Jacob, who died when Malachi was 19, leaving him the only skilled metalworker on the plantation. His cousin Jonas arrived 5 years ago, purchased from a failing plantation near Columbia, after Edward decided he needed 2 smiths to keep up with equipment repairs. Jonas was shorter, stockier, with eyes that seemed perpetually narrowed against some invisible light. He spoke even less than Malachi, communicating mostly through grunts and gestures at the forge. But his work was impeccable, precise, efficient, beautiful in the way functional things can be when made by hands that understand their craft. The 2 men worked side by side in the smithy, a small building set apart from the main quarters where the heat and noise of their trade wouldn't disturb the master's comfort. They reshaped plough blades, fixed cartwheels, forged chains of every size and purpose. The irony was not lost on either of them that they spent their days making the very implements of their own bondage. They rarely spoke about the past. Malachi knew Jonas had a wife and daughter sold off separately before he came to Ravenshade. Jonas knew Malachi's mother had died in childbirth with what would have been his sister. These facts hung between them like smoke, visible but intangible, acknowledged without words. What bound them together was not blood or history, but a shared understanding that survival meant swallowing rage so deep it burned the stomach like bad liquor. They watched men beaten for singing, women violated in the cookhouse while their children played outside, children sold away from mothers who screamed until their voices broke. And through it all, Edward Sinclair smiled his charming Charleston smile, hosting dinners where he was praised for his progressive agricultural methods and his careful management of resources. The mill represented the heart of his cruelty because it represented his efficiency. Everything fed into it: cotton, corn, animals past usefulness, and sometimes people who collapsed while working its mechanisms. The wheel never stopped during harvest season. Workers fed it in shifts, their exhaustion measured not by hours, but by how many times they stumbled. October 17th was the day everything changed, though nobody recognized it at the time. An elderly man named Samuel, who had worked at Ravenshade for 37 years, collapsed at the mill while hauling sacks of cotton to be processed. He was 61, which was ancient for an enslaved person, his body used up by decades of labor that would have broken 3 ordinary men. He simply stopped moving, one hand still gripping the sack, and crumpled onto the wooden floor beside the grinding mechanism. The overseer, a wiry man named Pike, who had learned his trade breaking horses, began kicking Samuel's prone form. When that produced no movement, Pike called for water to be thrown on him. When that failed, Pike reported to Edward that a slave was shirking at the mill. Edward arrived, still dressed from an afternoon social call, his silk waistcoat buttoned perfectly, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He looked at Samuel's motionless form with the same expression one might reserve for a broken tool. "Get him up," Edward said. "He won't get up, sir," Pike replied. "Been trying for 5 minutes." "Then make him." What happened next would be recounted in whispers for years, though those who witnessed it would struggle to find words adequate to the horror. Pike used his whip, not to encourage, but to punish unconsciousness itself. The leather cracked across Samuel's back, his legs, his head. Blood pooled on the wooden floor, mixing with cotton dust and oil from the machinery. Still, Samuel did not rise, because Samuel could not rise, because Samuel was dying or perhaps already dead. Edward watched with the detached interest of a man observing a scientific experiment. When Pike's arm tired, Edward took the whip himself. He struck Samuel 17 times, counting aloud, as if teaching arithmetic to a child. Other workers had been forced to gather, their presence required as witnesses to what happened when productivity faltered. Malachi stood at the edge of the crowd, Jonas beside him. They watched Samuel's body jerk with each impact, even though consciousness had long fled. They watched the master's face, flushed with exertion and alcohol, his eyes bright with something that looked almost like joy. They watched Pike hand Edward a fresh glass of bourbon when the whipping finished, watched Edward drink deeply before walking back to the big house for supper. Samuel died an hour later, without ever regaining consciousness. His body was dragged to the edge of the property and buried in an unmarked grave, one of dozens scattered across land that had drunk more blood than rain. That night, lying on the wooden platform that served as his bed, Malachi stared at the ceiling of the cabin he shared with 3 other men and understood with perfect clarity that silence was no longer possible. Survival had required swallowing rage, but rage swallowed long enough becomes something else entirely, becomes purpose, becomes plan, becomes the only truth that matters. In the darkness, Jonas's voice came quiet and certain. "It's time." Malachi did not ask what he meant. He did not need to. Some conversations happen in the space between words, in the shared breath of men who have endured the same nightmares. 3 days, Malachi whispered back. "We'll need 3 days to prepare." Jonas grunted agreement, and in that sound was contained all the grief and fury of 2 lifetimes lived in chains. Outside, the mill wheel turned in the darkness, grinding nothing but making its eternal noise, the sound that had become the heartbeat of Ravenshade Plantation. In 3 days, that heartbeat would change rhythm forever. The cousins did not sleep that night. They lay in darkness and planned the kind of justice that courts would never provide, that laws would never acknowledge, that history would struggle to name. They planned with the precision they brought to metalwork, accounting for every variable, every risk, every possible consequence. By dawn, when the bell rang calling workers to the fields, Malachi and Jonas rose like men reborn. They moved to the forge with their usual silence, their usual efficiency. To any observer, October 18th looked exactly like every other day at Ravenshade Plantation, but the wheel had already begun to turn. The forge occupied a peculiar space at Ravenshade, necessary but separate, valued but feared. Fire was a dangerous thing on a plantation where most structures were wood and thatch, where a single spark could undo a season's profit. The smithy had been built deliberately apart from other buildings, surrounded by cleared ground that turned to mud when it rained. A brick chimney rose from its center, constantly exhaling smoke that signaled the cousins were working. Inside, the heat was biblical. The forge itself dominated the space, a brick structure lined with fire brick that could withstand temperatures high enough to liquefy iron. Bellows hung nearby, their leather cracked from years of use but still functional. Tools covered every available surface. Hammers of varying weights, tongs in different sizes, files and rasps and chisels, each worn smooth by hands that knew their purpose. The anvil sat on a massive oak stump sunk deep into the earth, positioned perfectly to catch light from both the forge fire and the door. This was where Malachi and Jonas had spent thousands of hours transforming raw metal into useful objects. They had reshod every horse on the plantation, repaired every plough, forged every chain and shackle and lock that kept Ravenshade functioning. The irony burned hotter than any forge fire. They were literally making the instruments of their own oppression, their skilled hands ensuring the smooth operation of a system designed to destroy them. But skill cuts both ways, and the cousins understood metal better than Edward Sinclair understood the men who worked it. The morning after Samuel's murder, for murder was what it was, regardless of what laws said about property, Malachi began his preparations. He worked slowly, methodically, drawing no attention to tasks that could easily be explained as routine maintenance. He selected 3 lengths of chain from the storage rack, each approximately 15 feet long, links thick enough to hold a horse, but still manageable for a strong man to carry. These he cleaned and oiled, removing any rust that might cause weakness. Jonas, meanwhile, worked on smaller items, shackles with pins that could be removed quickly if one knew their construction, modified clasps that looked standard but opened with specific pressure points. These were backup measures, insurance against the possibility that their primary plan might fail. Both men had learned long ago that survival required redundancy, that the difference between escape and capture often came down to having anticipated one more variable than your pursuers. They worked in their customary silence, communicating through glances and small gestures developed over years of shared labor. When Pike made his rounds at midday, checking that all skilled workers remained productive, he saw only what he expected. 2 blacksmiths bent over their work, sweat gleaming on dark skin, the forge fire casting dancing shadows against smoke-stained walls. "Sinclair wants new hinges for the mill door," Pike announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "Needs them by tomorrow evening." Malachi nodded without looking up from the horseshoe he was shaping. "Yes, sir, they'll be ready." Pike lingered a moment, his pale eyes scanning the smithy as if expecting to find evidence of something illicit. But there was nothing to see except tools and metal, and men who knew better than to give him reason for punishment. Satisfied, he continued his rounds, his boots crunching across the cleared ground toward the cotton houses. When his footsteps faded, Jonas allowed himself the smallest smile. "Hinges," he murmured. "Perfect," Malachi agreed. The hinges provided an excuse to work late, to keep the forge fire burning after other workers had returned to their quarters. It also gave them access to the mill itself, an opportunity to study its mechanisms up close, to understand exactly how the wheel system operated and where its vulnerabilities lay. Edward Sinclair had expanded the mill twice since inheriting Ravenshade, adding equipment purchased from northern manufacturers who asked no questions about how southern prosperity was generated. The main wheel stood 16 feet in diameter, constructed of oak, reinforced with iron bands that Malachi himself had forged 5 years earlier. It was fed by a channel diverted from the Ashley River, controlled by a gate system that regulated water flow. When operating at full capacity, the wheel generated enough power to run 3 separate mechanisms: the cotton gin, a grain mill, and a bone grinder used for fertilizer production. The wheel's axle was massive, a single oak trunk stripped and shaped, reinforced with iron collars at stress points. It sat on iron bearings that Malachi had designed, modifications to the original system that had increased efficiency by 20%. Edward had praised this innovation, had given Malachi an extra portion of salt pork that week. At the time, Malachi had accepted the praise with lowered eyes, playing the role of grateful property pleased to serve his master well. Now, studying those same bearings by lamplight while Jonas worked on the hinges, Malachi saw them differently. He saw how the wheel's weight distributed across the axle, how the iron collars channeled force, how the entire mechanism depended on precise balance. He saw that a man secured to the wheel's outer rim would experience forces sufficient to crush bone, that the rotation would continue regardless of any obstruction unless the water flow was completely stopped. He saw how justice might look if one had the courage to forge it. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Both cousins maintained their normal routines, speaking when spoken to, working with their usual skill, giving no indication that anything had shifted in the fundamental order of their world. Other enslaved people moved through their own labor, heads down, voices low, each person locked in their private struggle for survival. But word traveled in the ways it always did on plantations, through glances at the well, whispers in the cotton rows, songs that carried double meanings. Everyone knew Samuel had died, everyone knew how and why, and everyone recognized that something was building, some pressure accumulating like steam in a sealed vessel. An elderly woman named Ruth, who had known Malachi since birth, caught his eye as he crossed the yard toward the cookhouse. She said nothing, but her expression contained volumes, grief and rage, and something that might have been hope, or might have been fear that hope would prove fatal. Malachi nodded once, barely perceptible, and continued walking. That night, Edward Sinclair hosted a small gathering in the big house. 3 neighboring planters arrived with their wives, carriages crunching up the shell-covered drive, servants in livery opening doors and taking wraps. Light blazed from every window, the sound of laughter and conversation drifted across the yard, punctuated by the clink of crystal and the occasional burst of feminine giggling. The enslaved workers knew these gatherings well. They meant the master would drink heavily, that he would boast about his methods and his profits, that he would eventually drink himself into unconsciousness while his guests either departed or settled into guest rooms, depending on distance and inebriation. These nights provided rare opportunities for rest, as Pike usually drank alongside the white folks and proved less vigilant in his patrols. Malachi and Jonas waited until midnight, when the sounds from the big house finally quieted and the last lamps were extinguished. The moon hung 3/4 full, providing enough light to navigate, but not so much as to eliminate shadows. October nights in Charleston could be unpredictable, sometimes warm as summer, sometimes crisp with approaching winter. Tonight was somewhere between, the air just cool enough to make breath visible. They moved silently from their cabin, carrying nothing that would seem unusual if they were spotted. The chains remained hidden in the smithy, along with the other materials they had prepared. They crossed the yard, avoiding patches where fallen leaves might crunch underfoot, using routes that kept them in darkness between buildings. The smithy door hung slightly open, as Malachi had left it, to avoid the squeal of hinges. Inside, the forge fire had died to coals that still radiated heat. Jonas rekindled it quickly, using the bellows to bring flames back to life with minimal smoke. They worked with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role without need for instruction. Malachi heated a length of iron rod until it glowed orange, then shaped it into a simple hook with a curved handle. This would serve as their insurance, a tool for manipulating hot metal without burning their hands. Jonas, meanwhile, prepared the chains, laying them out in careful coils that could be deployed quickly without tangling. "He'll be unconscious," Jonas said quietly, the first word spoken between them since morning. "He will," Malachi confirmed. "Pike gave him a new bottle of bourbon this afternoon, saw him carrying it to the study. The wheel? I'll open the gate. Water flow should be strong enough from the recent rains." Jonas nodded, his face illuminated by forge light, showing no emotion except perhaps a certain grim determination. "If we're caught—" "We won't be caught," Malachi interrupted. "But if we are, we die anyway. This way, we die meaning something." Neither man spoke Samuel's name, but his presence filled the smithy like smoke, invisible but undeniable. They had not been close to the old man. Closeness was a luxury that plantation life rarely afforded. But his murder represented something larger than individual grief. It represented the accumulated weight of every injustice witnessed, every cruelty endured, every moment of humanity denied. At 1 in the morning, they extinguished the forge and gathered their materials. The walk to the big house took 5 minutes across ground they had crossed thousands of times. The building loomed white and graceful in moonlight, its columns casting long shadows across the lawn. Somewhere inside, Edward Sinclair slept the sleep of a man who had never questioned his right to absolute power over other human beings. The study windows on the ground floor remained dark. Malachi approached carefully, testing the window frame with gentle pressure. Unlocked. They rarely locked doors at Ravenshade, secure in the belief that their authority was absolute, that no enslaved person would dare violate the sanctity of the master's house. The window slid open with barely a whisper. Malachi climbed through first, Jonas following with the chains. They stood in darkness, allowing their eyes to adjust, breathing quietly while listening for any sound of movement from the upper floors. Edward's study smelled of leather and tobacco and bourbon. A desk dominated one wall, papers scattered across its surface. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes on agriculture and law and philosophy that justified treating humans as property. A decanter sat on a side table, nearly empty, a single glass beside it, showing evidence of heavy use. The master himself lay sprawled on a leather sofa, still dressed in his evening clothes, though his jacket had been removed and his shirt hung open. The empty bourbon bottle lay on the floor beside him. His breathing came heavy and rhythmic, the sound of a man thoroughly unconscious and unlikely to wake soon. Malachi and Jonas stood over him for a moment, looking down at the face that had haunted their nightmares, the hands that had signed orders for countless punishments, the body that had never known a day of forced labor or the kiss of a whip. In that moment, they could have killed him easily. A pillow over the face, hands around the throat, any number of quick methods that would end his life while he slept. But that would have been mercy, and mercy was not what they had come to deliver. Jonas moved first, securing Edward's wrists with rope they had prepared, binding them tightly enough to cut off circulation. Malachi did the same with his ankles. When Edward stirred slightly, muttering something incomprehensible, Jonas pressed a cloth soaked in whiskey against his face until his breathing steadied again. Dragging an unconscious man proved harder than either cousin had anticipated. Edward was not a small person, and dead weight resists movement in ways that complicate even simple tasks. They managed it through a combination of determination and brute strength developed through years of forge work, pulling him out the window and across the lawn toward the mill. The mill stood dark and silent, its great wheel motionless without water flow to drive it. The building itself was larger than most structures on the plantation, built to accommodate the various mechanisms and the workers who fed them. Its door hung on the new hinges Malachi had installed just that afternoon, swinging open smoothly when Jonas pulled it. Inside, the machinery loomed in darkness like sleeping beasts. The main wheel dominated the far wall, its oak surface smooth from years of water flow. The grinding mechanism sat silent, their stones and gears waiting for dawn, when workers would return to feed them cotton and grain and whatever else needed processing. Jonas lit a lantern, adjusting the flame to provide just enough light to work by without being visible from outside. Malachi moved to the water gate, a system of levers and counterweights that controlled flow from the river channel. He pulled the main lever, hearing the distant rush of water as it began filling the wheel's buckets. The wheel shuddered, then began to turn. Slowly at first, creaking as if awakening from sleep, then faster as water weight accumulated. The sound of its movement filled the mill, a deep rhythmic grinding that Malachi had heard 10,000 times, but which tonight sounded like something else entirely. Tonight it sounded like inevitability. They had perhaps 20 minutes before the wheel reached full speed. Working quickly, they dragged Edward's unconscious form to the wheel and lifted him against its outer rim. Malachi had calculated the placement carefully, high enough that his body would clear the ground during rotation, low enough that they could secure him without excessive difficulty. The chains wrapped around him 3 times, crossing at chest and thighs, secured through the wheel's spokes to ensure he would not slip free. Jonas tested the bonds with all his strength, pulling against iron links that had held horses and mules and countless other loads. They would hold a man. Edward stirred again, consciousness beginning to return as the alcohol's effects faded. His eyes opened, confused at first, then widening as awareness returned, and he recognized both his location and his situation. "What?" he began, but Malachi pressed a hand over his mouth. "No," Malachi said quietly. "You don't get to speak. You've done enough speaking. For once in your miserable life, you're going to listen." Edward Sinclair had never known fear before that moment. He had inspired it, witnessed it, used it as a tool to maintain order and maximize profit. But he had never experienced the cold weight of absolute terror that now pressed against his chest, harder than the chains binding him to the wheel. His mind struggled to process the impossibility of his situation. Enslaved people did not attack masters. The social order that governed plantation life was absolute, enforced by law and violence and the overwhelming power of the state. Yet here he was, chained to his own mill wheel by 2 men he had never bothered to see as fully human, 2 sets of hands he had valued only for their ability to reshape metal. The wheel continued its rotation, carrying him slowly upward. At its current speed, a full revolution took approximately 40 seconds. Malachi had calculated this carefully, fast enough that Edward would experience the terror of continuous movement, slow enough that death would not come quickly. Jonas removed the gag once they were certain Edward's screams would not carry to the sleeping quarters, where Pike and the house servants lay. Let him scream, Jonas thought. Let him feel what it was like to cry out, knowing no help would come, no mercy would be granted. "Please," Edward gasped when he could draw breath. "Please, I'll give you anything. Money, freedom papers, You'll what?" Malachi interrupted, his voice carrying a coldness that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who knew him as the quiet blacksmith. "You'll give us what was ours by birth? You'll return the years you stole? You'll resurrect Samuel and every other person you've beaten to death for your entertainment?" The wheel carried Edward higher, rotating him until he hung nearly upside down. Blood rushed to his head, making his face purple in the lamplight. Then down again, the chains cutting into his flesh as gravity pulled against them, then up once more in an endless cycle. Jonas stood watching with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of accumulated grief. "My daughter was 8 years old when they sold her. Do you remember that?" "Probably not. You signed the papers, though. I watched you drink bourbon while the trader counted out money for my child. She cried for me when they put her in the wagon. I can still hear it." Edward tried to respond, but the rotation had carried him back to the inverted position, and his words came out as gasps and whimpers. Malachi made an adjustment to the water gate, increasing the flow slightly. The wheel's pace quickened, its revolutions shortening to 35 seconds, then 30. "Samuel worked here for 37 years, Malachi continued, speaking as if giving a lecture on a subject he had studied carefully. "He raised 6 children who were sold away. He buried his wife when she died in childbirth. He never complained, never resisted, just worked every day from sunup to sunset. Yesterday you beat him to death because he collapsed from exhaustion. You beat a dying man because it annoyed you that he couldn't work anymore." The wheel turned. Edward vomited, the contents of his stomach spraying across the mill floor. The chains cut deeper, breaking skin, blood beginning to seep through his fine linen shirt. His breathing came in ragged gasps, punctuated by sobs. "We're not doing this for revenge," Jonas said, moving closer to the wheel so Edward could see his face clearly. "Revenge would be too simple, too much like what you would do. We're doing this because someone has to. Because there has to be a consequence for what you've done, what men like you do every day. You built your fortune on broken bodies and you called it civilization. You tortured people for entertainment and you called it discipline. You owned human beings and you called it your right." The wheel continued its rotation, indifferent to the man chained to its surface, to his pleas and screams and increasingly desperate offers of bargaining. Malachi had built this wheel, had designed its bearings and reinforced its structure, had made it efficient and reliable. Now it served a different purpose, grinding not cotton but the illusion that cruelty could exist without consequence. They let it run for 7 minutes, watching Edward's mind break as surely as his body was breaking. 7 minutes that must have felt like hours, to a man experiencing the kind of helplessness he had inflicted on others without ever imagining how it might feel. 7 minutes that represented 37 years of Samuel's labor, compressed into moments of pure terror. Then Malachi moved to the water gate again, but this time he did not slow the wheel. He opened the gate fully, releasing the channel's complete flow. The wheel responded instantly, its speed doubling, then tripling as tons of water filled its buckets and gravity pulled them downward. Edward's screams took on a different quality, no longer pleas, but simply raw terror, the sound an animal makes when it understands death is coming and no amount of struggling will prevent it. The chains held perfectly, Malachi's metalwork proving its quality even in this horrific application. But Edward's body was not made of iron. Bones broke, joints separated. The wheel showed no more mercy than Edward had shown to any of his victims. Jonas turned away, not from guilt, but from a sudden understanding that watching would make them too much like the man being destroyed. This was necessary, was justice, was the only truth available to people, denied all other forms of redress. But it did not need to be savored. Malachi watched, though, his face illuminated by lamplight, his expression that of a man witnessing something inevitable. He watched until Edward's screams stopped, until the body chained to the wheel hung limp and broken, until the only sound in the mill was the grinding of oak against stone and the rush of water that powered it all. Then he closed the water gate. The wheel slowed gradually, its momentum carrying it through several more revolutions before finally stopping. In the sudden silence, both cousins stood without moving, their bodies tense, waiting for shouting voices or the sound of approaching footsteps. But the night remained quiet, except for distant marsh sounds and the occasional bark of plantation dogs too far away to have heard anything unusual. They worked quickly now, aware that dawn would come whether they were ready or not. The chains came off first, Malachi's fingers working the pins he had designed for exactly this purpose. Edward's body, broken beyond any possibility of identification through normal means, remained on the wheel where it hung like some terrible artwork. Jonas had prepared the next phase carefully. From a satchel hidden near the mill door, he withdrew a clay jug filled with oil mixed with cotton fiber, a combination that would burn hot and fast. They poured it across the mill floor, saturating the wooden planks, coating the machinery, ensuring that fire would consume everything thoroughly. The final touch was a message, an explanation for any who might wonder what had happened here. Using a chisel from the smithy and working by lamplight, Malachi carved words into the millstone itself, into granite that would survive whatever fire might do to the wooden structure around it. "We turned it once for you." 6 words that contained everything. A statement of agency, of deliberate action, of the wheel that grinds in both directions. 6 words that would ensure this act was understood not as random violence, but as calculated justice delivered by men who had counted the cost and paid it willingly. They lit the fire as false dawn began to grey the eastern sky. The oil-soaked wood caught immediately, flames racing across the mill floor, climbing walls, consuming the wheel that had turned for the last time. Malachi and Jonas stood outside, watching the blaze grow, feeling its heat on their faces like a second sunrise. "We have maybe an hour," Malachi said quietly. Jonas nodded. They had prepared for this moment, had hidden supplies in the marsh, had planned routes that would take them away from roads and towns where slave catchers might look. Survival was not guaranteed. Nothing ever was for men in their position, but they would die free if they died, would die as men who had acted rather than endured. They moved through the darkness toward the edge of the plantation, toward the marshland that stretched for miles along the Ashley River. Behind them, flames climbed higher, finally reaching a height where someone in the big house might notice. Shouts began echoing across the yard as workers emerged from cabins, as Pike stumbled out of his quarters, as the entire plantation woke to discover that something fundamental had shifted in the order of their world. But the cousins were already gone, swallowed by marsh grass and morning mist, 2 men who had learned that some wheels are meant to be turned, that some fires are meant to be lit, that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied if you are willing to forge it with your own hands. The last thing they heard before the marsh closed around them was Pike's voice, raised in a shriek of dismay. "The mill's burning! The mill's burning! Someone get water!" No one mentioned the master, not yet. That discovery would come later, when the flames died enough for people to see what remained, chained to the wheel. For now, Ravenshade Plantation burned, and 2 men who had built its prosperity walked away from it without looking back. Pike discovered Edward Sinclair's remains 3 hours after sunrise, when the mill fire had finally burned itself down to smoking rubble and twisted metal. What was left barely resembled anything human, bones broken and scattered, flesh burned away, the chains fused by heat into the wheel's warped structure. Only the millstone remained intact, its granite surface blackened by smoke, but still bearing the carved message that would haunt Charleston society for years to come. The overseer vomited twice before he could make himself approach close enough to confirm what he was seeing. Then he ran for the big house, shouting for someone to ride immediately to Charleston, to fetch the sheriff, to alert the neighboring planters that something unprecedented had happened at Ravenshade. By mid-morning, the plantation swarmed with white men on horseback. Sheriff Thomas Crane from Charleston, 3 neighboring planters, including the ones who had dined with Edward 2 nights before, a slave catcher named Hicks, who kept dogs trained specifically for tracking runaways, and a dozen other men, drawn by news that traveled through the low country like wildfire. They stood in a circle around the ruined mill, staring at the remains and the carved message, their faces showing various combinations of horror, rage, and something that might have been fear. If enslaved people could do this to Edward Sinclair, could kill a master in his own plantation, then the entire social order they depended on was revealed as more fragile than they had believed. "Who did this?" Sheriff Crane asked Pike, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Which ones ran?" Pike stammered through his answer. "The Smiths, sir. Malachi and Jonas. They're missing since last night. Nobody saw them after midnight." "Descriptions," Hicks interrupted, already unleashing his dogs to sniff around the mill ruins. "Ages, distinguishing marks, anything that might help track them." Pike provided what details he could. Malachi, 31, tall, scarred hands from forge work, no distinguishing facial features. Jonas, 28, shorter and heavier, a burn scar on his left forearm from an accident years ago. Both skilled metalworkers, both generally quiet and compliant until they apparently decided to murder their master and burn his mill. The dogs picked up a trail leading toward the marsh, but lost it within a quarter-mile, where water and mud obscured any scent. Hicks cursed, knowing from experience that the low-country marshlands offered infinite hiding places for men who knew how to navigate them. The cousins could be 5 miles away by now, or 50, could have taken boats into the river system or followed game trails that wound through marsh grass taller than a man's head. Post-rewards, one of the planters, a man named Whitmore who owned the neighboring plantation, said firmly, $500 for each of them, dead or alive. Make it known throughout the state. Someone will talk. Sheriff Crane nodded, already composing the notice in his mind. But another planter, an older man named Beaufort, who had been in the slave business for 40 years, spoke up with a note of caution. "We need to be careful how we handle this," Beaufort said slowly. "If word spreads about what happened here, about slaves killing a master and escaping, it could inspire others. We need to find these men, absolutely. But we also need to control the narrative." The other men understood immediately. Fear was a tool they used against enslaved populations, but it could cut both ways. If the story of Malachi and Jonas spread unchecked, it might give ideas to others who had endured similar treatment, might suggest that resistance was possible after all. "What do we tell people?" Whitmore asked. "The truth, but carefully," Beaufort replied. "Edward is dead. The mill burned. 2 slaves are missing and presumed responsible. We're offering rewards for their capture, but we emphasize that this was an isolated incident by particularly criminal individuals, not representative of any broader dissatisfaction. We make it clear that such acts will be punished with extreme prejudice, that any slave who harbors or assists these criminals will face execution." It was agreed. The notices went out that afternoon, carried by riders to every town and plantation within 100 miles. Descriptions of Malachi and Jonas appeared on printed sheets posted in courthouses, taverns, and markets. The rewards were substantial enough to ensure that slave catchers throughout the region would be watching for 2 skilled blacksmiths traveling together. But the cousins had anticipated this response, had prepared for it during the 3 days between Samuel's murder and their own act of justice. They knew that survival required becoming invisible, that 2 men traveling together would draw attention while a single man working as hired labor might pass unnoticed. They had separated before dawn, embracing briefly in the marsh darkness before heading in different directions, with a plan to reunite in 6 months at a specific location they had identified from stolen maps. Jonas headed north following the Ashley River, while Malachi turned south toward the coast, both men carrying nothing that would identify them as runaways beyond the color of their skin and the scars that marked bodies subjected to years of forced labor. Malachi moved through the marshland like a ghost, using techniques learned from other enslaved people who had attempted escape over the years. He traveled only at night, sleeping during daylight in dense thickets, where dogs would have difficulty tracking his scent. He ate raw fish caught with his hands and vegetation identified from knowledge passed down through oral tradition. When he had to cross open ground, he did so during rain, when visibility was poor, and his trail would wash away quickly. 3 days after leaving Ravenshade, he reached the coast near a small fishing community where free blacks and poor whites lived in uneasy proximity, eking out subsistence from catching shrimp and oysters. He observed the community for 2 days from hiding, studying its rhythms and routines, looking for an opportunity to acquire the papers that would allow him to move more freely. The opportunity came in the form of an elderly, free black man named Isaiah, who worked alone repairing fishing nets on a dock at the edge of the settlement. Malachi approached at dusk when the dock was otherwise empty, moving slowly with his hands visible to show he carried no weapon. Isaiah looked up from his work, his ancient eyes studying Malachi with an expression that suggested he understood exactly what he was seeing. A runaway, desperate and dangerous in the way that desperate men always are. "You lost, son?" Isaiah asked quietly. "No, sir," Malachi replied. "I know exactly where I am. I'm wondering if you might help me get somewhere else." Isaiah set down his net-mending tools and gestured for Malachi to sit. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Isaiah sighed, the sound of a man who had lived through too much to be surprised by anything anymore. "You're the one from Ravenshade," Isaiah said. It was not a question. Malachi felt his heart race, but kept his expression neutral. "What makes you say that?" "Because I can read, and I've seen the notices. 2 smiths killed their master and burned his mill. Rewards posted for their capture. Descriptions match you well enough, though you've lost weight these past few days." For a moment, Malachi considered running, but exhaustion and hunger had worn him down, and something in Isaiah's tone suggested this was not necessarily a hostile conversation. "If you've seen the notices, you know what they're offering for me. That's substantial money for a man in your position." "It is," Isaiah agreed. "It's also blood money, and I'm too old to carry that weight." He pulled out a pipe and tobacco pouch, taking his time packing and lighting it before continuing. "My father was enslaved, bought his freedom working extra as a cooper, took him 23 years of saving every penny. I was born free because of his sacrifice. I understand what you did and why you did it. Will you help me?" Isaiah smoked in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I have papers for my nephew who died last winter. Never got around to reporting his death because, honestly, papers for a free black man have value, even if the man they describe is gone. You don't look much like him, but most white folks can't tell us apart anyway. Can you read?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Then you can memorize the details. Birthplace, approximate age, occupation. You'll be Joshua Williams, freedman born in Virginia, working your way south doing metal work. It's plausible enough to get you past casual inspection, but it won't hold up to serious scrutiny. Best you keep moving." Isaiah disappeared into his small cabin and returned with a folded document sealed with wax. He handed it to Malachi, along with a coat that had seen better days and a cloth bundle containing cornbread and dried fish. "There's a cargo ship leaving Charleston harbor in 4 days, heading to Philadelphia," Isaiah said. "Mostly rice and indigo, but the captain sometimes takes on passengers willing to work for passage. He's not particular about checking papers too carefully if you seem capable. The ship's called the Meridian. You get on that ship, you might have a chance." Malachi tried to find words adequate to express what this kindness meant, but Isaiah waved him off. "Don't thank me. Just live well. That's the best revenge against men like Sinclair, surviving when they expected you to die, thriving when they bet everything on breaking you." Malachi left the dock that night carrying papers that transformed him, at least on paper, from property to person. The coat Isaiah had given him marked him as someone with resources, no longer the barefoot runaway the notices described. He had shaved his head using a stolen razor, changing his appearance enough that casual observers might not connect him to the descriptions being circulated. The 4 days until the Meridian's departure, he spent hidden in an abandoned rice barn outside Charleston, exercising iron discipline to remain motionless during daylight hours when slave catchers and their dogs regularly patrolled the roads. He could hear them sometimes, shouting to each other, the dogs baying as they picked up and lost various trails. Twice, searchers passed within 30 feet of his hiding place without discovering him. On the 4th night, he made his way to Charleston's harbor, moving through streets crowded enough that one more person of color would draw no particular attention. The Meridian sat at dock like every other merchant vessel, workers loading the last of its cargo by lamplight, while the captains supervised and cursed at anyone working too slowly. Malachi approached the captain directly, his forged papers in hand. His manner that of a free man seeking honest work. "Sir, I'm looking for passage north. I'm a skilled blacksmith, and I can work for my keep." The captain, a weathered man named Morrison who had been sailing coastal routes for 30 years, barely glanced at the papers before handing them back. "We sail with the morning tide. You'll work the cargo holds and do whatever else the mate tells you. No pay beyond passage and meals. You cause trouble, you swim home. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Understood. Be aboard before dawn. We leave whether you're ready or not." That night, sleeping in the Meridian's cargo hold among bales of indigo and barrels of rice, Malachi allowed himself to believe that escape might actually be possible. But he knew Jonas was still out there somewhere, still running, still pursued. 6 months until their planned reunion. 6 months to survive and somehow make his way to the meeting point they had identified. 6 months was an eternity for a hunted man. But they had turned the wheel, had carved their message in stone, had demonstrated that cruelty would not forever go unanswered. Whatever happened next, that truth remained. Jonas headed north following the Ashley River, moving through terrain he had studied from maps stolen over the years from Edward Sinclair's study. The maps were imperfect, created by white surveyors who cared only about property boundaries and major waterways, ignoring the countless small channels and paths that threaded through the low country. But Jonas had supplemented those stolen glimpses with knowledge gathered from other enslaved people, from stories told in whispers about those who had run before, about routes that offered the best chance of reaching free territory. The geography of escape in 1843 South Carolina was brutally simple. To the east lay the Atlantic Ocean, offering no escape unless one could somehow secure passage on a northbound ship. To the west lay hundreds of miles of slave-holding territory stretching to the Mississippi River. South meant Georgia and Florida, both firmly committed to slavery. Only north offered any possibility of freedom, and even that required crossing hundreds of miles of hostile territory where every white person was legally obliged to question any black person traveling alone. Jonas understood that the odds of reaching Pennsylvania or New York alive were approximately 0. He had heard the statistics repeated often enough by masters who wanted enslaved people to understand the futility of resistance. For every successful escape, 10 people were captured and returned to face punishments designed to deter others from attempting the same. Many more died in the attempt, killed by slave catchers, drowned crossing rivers, succumbing to exposure or starvation or infected wounds. But Jonas also understood that survival under slavery was itself a form of slow death, that watching his daughter sold away had killed something essential in him that no amount of continued breathing could resurrect. The wheel they had turned at Ravenshade had been both justice for Samuel and liberation for themselves, an acknowledgement that some truths matter more than survival. He travelled by night, sleeping in daylight in whatever cover he could find. The first week he covered approximately 40 miles, following the river through marshland and forest, avoiding roads and settlements, eating whatever he could catch or forage. His body began to change, losing the thick muscle that forgework had built, becoming leaner and harder, adapting to constant movement and insufficient food. 10 days after leaving Ravenshade, Jonas encountered his first serious obstacle, a tributary too deep to ford and too wide to swim without significant risk. He followed it upstream for 2 days, looking for a crossing point, aware that every detour cost time and depleted his limited energy reserves. The crossing came in the form of a fallen tree, a massive cypress that had toppled during a recent storm, its trunk spanning the water like a natural bridge. Jonas crossed at dawn, moving carefully across bark slippery with morning dew, trying not to think about the water below or what might happen if he fell. Halfway across, he heard dogs. The sound came from behind him, distant but unmistakable, the baying of hounds trained to track human scent. Slave catchers, probably following a trail he had left days ago that had finally brought them to this point. Jonas estimated he had perhaps 15 minutes before they reached the fallen tree, maybe less if they were pushing their dogs hard. He scrambled across the remaining distance and dropped to the far side, his mind racing through options. Running was pointless. Dogs would track him regardless of how fast he moved. Fighting was suicide. Slave catchers traveled armed and in groups, and they were legally permitted to kill runaways who resisted. His only chance was to break the trail somehow, to do something unexpected that would cost them enough time to slip away. Water. Dogs lost scent in water, everyone knew that, but there was no time to follow the tributary to deeper water where swimming might be possible. Unless... Jonas looked at the fallen cypress, at the water flowing beneath it, at the thick vegetation growing along both banks. An idea formed, desperate and risky, but potentially effective. He waded into the water upstream from the fallen tree, moving carefully to avoid creating ripples that might be visible to approaching searchers. The water was cold and thick with sediment, barely knee-deep where he entered, but deepening quickly as he moved toward the center channel. When the water reached his chest, Jonas took a deep breath and submerged completely, gripping the cypress roots beneath the surface to keep himself anchored against the current. The water was dark and murky, visibility near zero, his lungs already burning from the breath he had taken before submerging. He forced himself to remain still, to trust that the dogs would lose his scent at the water's edge, that the searchers would assume he had crossed the tree and continue on the far bank. He heard them arrive, though the water muffled the sound. Shouts, dogs splashing along the bank, the creak of leather and metal as men dismounted from horses. One voice rose above the others, harsh and commanding. "Dogs lost the trail here. Check both sides, he might have doubled back." Jonas's lungs screamed for air. Black spots appeared at the edges of his vision. His grip on the roots began to weaken as his body demanded oxygen. Just a few more seconds, he told himself. Just let them move away from this spot. The voices faded slightly as searchers spread out along both banks. Jonas surfaced as quietly as he could, his face barely breaking the water's surface, drawing a gasping breath that sounded impossibly loud to his own ears but apparently went unnoticed by the men 40 feet away. He submerged again immediately, listening through water for sounds that would indicate whether his gamble had worked. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The sounds of searching moved gradually upstream as the slave catchers followed the banks, looking for where the trail might resume. Jonas remained submerged with only his nose and mouth above water, hidden by overhanging vegetation, his body going numb from cold, but his mind sharp with the understanding that this was the moment that would determine whether he lived or died. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the sounds of pursuit faded completely. Jonas waited another 20 minutes to be certain, then slowly waded downstream, moving through water that would obscure any trail, putting distance between himself and the searchers, before eventually climbing out on the opposite bank, half a mile from where he had entered. He collapsed in thick brush, shaking from cold and exhaustion and delayed terror. For several minutes he simply lay there, breathing, letting his body recover while his mind processed how close he had come to capture. The burn scar on his left forearm, the distinguishing mark Pike had mentioned in the descriptions circulated to slave catchers, seemed to pulse with heat despite the cold water still dripping from his clothes. That night, Jonas made a decision. The scar had to go. It was too distinctive, too easily identified. Using a knife stolen from Ravenshade's toolshed, he reopened the old burn and deliberately infected it with mud from the riverbank. The pain was extraordinary, but pain was temporary while capture meant death or worse. Over the following week, the infected wound festered, swelling his entire forearm until he worried he might lose the limb. But when it finally began to heal, the scar's distinctive pattern had been obscured by new tissue, transformed into something less identifiable. He continued north, moving through territory that grew gradually less familiar. The low country gave way to Piedmont, marshland replaced by rolling hills and denser forest. The river he had been following eventually turned westward, forcing Jonas to abandon it and strike north through unfamiliar terrain, using the North Star as his only reliable guide. 3 weeks after leaving Ravenshade, he reached the North Carolina border, marked not by any sign, but by a change in the land itself. Different vegetation, different bird calls, a subtle shift in the quality of light that signaled he had moved beyond the immediate sphere of Charleston's influence. But North Carolina was still slave territory, still hostile ground where every encounter with white people carried the risk of questions about his status and destination. Jonas began moving only on nights when the moon was new, when darkness was absolute, and navigation became a matter of counting paces and dead reckoning rather than sight. He developed techniques for determining direction by feeling the bark of trees. Moss grew thicker on northern sides, and by studying the way water flowed in small streams. He also began to hear news, fragments of information gathered from watching free black workers in fields or listening to conversations in small towns he skirted carefully. The story of Ravenshade had spread beyond Charleston, had become legend among enslaved populations who retold it in whispers, sometimes adding details that were not accurate but which served a deeper truth. Some said the cousins had killed Sinclair with their bare hands. Others claimed they had burned the entire plantation to the ground. A few versions held that they had freed every enslaved person at Ravenshade and led them all to freedom. Jonas understood that these exaggerations served a purpose, that the story had become larger than the reality, that Malachi and he had somehow become symbols of resistance that transcended the specific act of justice they had delivered. It was both humbling and terrifying. Humbling to think that their actions might inspire others, terrifying to imagine the reprisals that masters might inflict to demonstrate that such inspiration was misplaced. 6 weeks into his journey, Jonas encountered his first serious illness. Fever took him suddenly, burning through his body like fire through dry grass. He holed up in an abandoned tobacco barn, delirious and helpless, certain that this was how he would die. Not captured by slave catchers, but killed by infection or illness, or simply the accumulated cost of constant flight. In his delirium, he saw his daughter's face, remembered her voice calling for him as the slave trader's wagon pulled away. He saw Samuel's body jerking under Edward Sinclair's whip. He saw Malachi's face illuminated by forge fire as they planned their justice. These images repeated endlessly, mixing with fever dreams where the mill wheel turned forever, grinding not cotton, but the souls of everyone who had suffered at Ravenshade. He woke after 3 days to find an elderly black woman sitting beside him, spooning broth into his mouth, her face deeply lined, but her eyes kind. She introduced herself as Ruth, not the same Ruth who had known Malachi at Ravenshade, but another woman who bore that name, and who had chosen to risk her own safety to help a stranger who was obviously running from something. "You were calling out names," Ruth said softly. "Malachi, Jonas, Samuel. I figure you're one of those two that the notices describe." Figure you're probably Jonas since you kept saying your cousin's name. Jonas tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. Are you going to turn me in? Ruth's laugh was bitter. Child, I may be free on paper, but I know what those papers are worth. I know what system created them and what system can destroy them any time it wants. I'm not turning you in. I'm going to feed you and nurse you back to health, and then you're going to continue north and forget you ever met me. Why? Because what you did mattered, Ruth said simply. Word reached here about Ravenshade, about two cousins who turned the wheel on their master. People talk about it in whispers like it's a story or a myth. But I see you here, sick and running and barely alive, and I understand it was real. So I'm helping because someone has to, because otherwise stories like yours end with men dying alone in abandoned barns, and I refuse to live in a world where that's the only ending possible. Malachi stood on the deck of the Meridian as it sailed into Philadelphia harbor on a grey November morning, 6 weeks after leaving Charleston. The city rose before him like something from a dream, buildings of brick and stone, church steeples pointing toward low clouds, ships from a dozen nations crowding the docks. Somewhere in that sprawling metropolis lived free black communities, abolitionist organizations, people who might help a fugitive slave begin an actual life rather than simply continuing to run. Captain Morrison had proven true to his word, asking no uncomfortable questions as long as Malachi worked hard and caused no trouble. The voyage north had been uneventful, except for one encounter with a revenue cutter that had briefly boarded to inspect cargo. Malachi had remained below during that inspection, his heart hammering while he listened to boots on the deck above and voices asking about the ship's manifest and destination. But the revenue officers had been looking for smuggled goods, not fugitive slaves, and they departed without searching the crew quarters. Now, standing in morning light watching Philadelphia approach, Malachi allowed himself to feel something that might have been hope, not safety. He understood that nowhere in America was truly safe for someone who looked like him and carried the scars of slavery on his body. But possibility, at least, the chance to be something other than property, to work for wages rather than whips, to walk through streets without constant fear of slave catchers. The Meridian docked at a pier crowded with commercial vessels. Morrison paid off his crew in cash, including Malachi, who had earned $20 for 6 weeks of labor, more money than he had ever held in his life. Good luck, the captain said, shaking Malachi's hand with surprising warmth. Whatever you're running from, I hope you make it. You're a good worker. Malachi took his money and his forged papers identifying him as Joshua Williams Friedman and walked down the gangplank into Philadelphia. The city overwhelmed his senses immediately. So many people, such noise, languages he didn't recognize mixing with accents he had never heard. Vendors hawked goods from carts, wagons clattered over cobblestones. Somewhere a church bell rang, marking mid-morning. He had walked perhaps 3 blocks when a well-dressed black man approached him directly, his manner suggesting both authority and concern. "You're new to the city," the man said. Not a question, an observation. Malachi nodded cautiously, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife hidden in his coat. Just arrived. From the south, I'd wager. You have that look about you. Careful, watchful, expecting trouble. I'm William Still. I work with the Vigilance Committee, helping people like yourself transition to life in the free states. Would you like assistance? Every instinct developed through years of slavery screamed at Malachi to trust no one, to assume every offer of help was a trap. But something in William Still's manner suggested sincerity, and Malachi was exhausted enough to take the risk. What kind of assistance? Temporary housing while you get established? Help finding legitimate employment? Legal advice if needed. We're a network of people, black and white, though mostly black, who believe that slavery is an abomination and that those fleeing it deserve support. Still paused, studying Malachi's face carefully. You're running from something specific, aren't you? Not just slavery in general, but something that happened recently that makes your situation more dangerous than usual. Malachi said nothing, but his expression must have revealed something because Still nodded slowly. "It's all right. Many people come to us with stories they're not ready to share. The important thing is that you're here now, and we can help you begin again." He led Malachi through Philadelphia's streets to a modest building in a neighborhood where black faces predominated. Inside, several other recently arrived fugitives sat nervously in a common room, their expressions mirroring the same combination of hope and terror that Malachi felt. A white woman named Mary introduced herself as Still's colleague, explaining the various resources available and the precautions necessary even in a free state. "Pennsylvania law provides some protection," Mary explained to the group, "but slave catchers still operate here, and federal law requires that fugitives be returned to their owners if captured. So you must remain vigilant. We'll help you establish identities and find work, but your safety ultimately depends on your own caution." Over the following weeks, Malachi began to build something that resembled a life. He found work at a foundry operated by a Quaker named Thomas Kent, who asked no questions about his papers and paid fair wages for skilled metalwork. He rented a room in a boarding house, catering to single black men, sharing meals and conversation with others who had made similar journeys north. He attended meetings at Mother Bethel Church, where he heard sermons about dignity and freedom, delivered by a black minister who spoke as if these concepts were self-evident rather than revolutionary. But he thought constantly about Jonas, wondered whether his cousin had survived, whether the separation they had agreed upon had been wise or had simply doomed them both to die alone. The 6-month reunion deadline they had established loomed in his mind. 3 more months until they were supposed to meet at a specific location they had identified from stolen maps, a place near the North Carolina border that seemed remote enough to offer some safety. Meanwhile, in North Carolina, Jonas continued his journey north with the help of Ruth and others like her, free blacks and poor whites who formed an informal network moving fugitives along paths invisible to authorities. He worked for a week at a blacksmith shop owned by a white abolitionist who needed help but couldn't advertise openly for fear of reprisals from pro-slavery neighbors. He spent 2 weeks recovering in a barn owned by a Quaker family who fed him and mended his clothes and prayed over him in a language that assumed God cared about the fate of enslaved people. Each person who helped him took enormous risks. Aiding a fugitive slave could result in heavy fines, imprisonment, or worse if local pro-slavery sentiment ran strong. But they helped anyway, motivated by religious conviction or moral principle, or simply the human recognition that suffering demands response. Jonas heard news as he traveled. The rewards for his and Malachi's capture had increased to $700 each, a sum that would tempt even sympathetic people to betray them. Slave catchers from Charleston had spread throughout the region, showing drawings that bore little resemblance to reality, but which still made Jonas nervous every time he saw them posted in towns he passed through. 3 months after leaving Ravenshade, Jonas reached Virginia, crossing the border during a rainstorm that reduced visibility to nearly zero. Virginia was still slave territory, but it was also home to the largest population of free blacks in the South, communities that had existed for generations and which provided some cover for people like him to move with slightly less scrutiny. He found work in Richmond for 6 weeks, using his metalworking skills to earn enough money to purchase better clothes and provisions for the final leg of his journey to the meeting point. He heard more stories about Ravenshade during this time. The plantation had been sold, divided into smaller parcels, its notorious reputation making it difficult to find buyers willing to continue operating under the Sinclair name. The mill ruins remained, locals said, avoided by everyone because of superstitions about what had happened there. The story had taken on mythological qualities in some retellings. Some claimed the wheel still turned at night, powered by Edward Sinclair's ghost condemned to eternal grinding. Others said you could hear screaming if you approached the ruins on moonless nights. A few insisted the cousins had been devils in human form, supernatural agents of vengeance, rather than desperate men pushed beyond endurance. Jonas knew the truth was simpler and more human. Two men who had decided that some injustices demanded response regardless of consequence, who had turned the wheel not through supernatural power, but through the same metalworking skills that had made them valuable to the man they killed. 6 months and 3 days after leaving Ravenshade, Jonas reached the meeting point, a specific cypress tree beside a creek near the North Carolina border, identifiable by its distinctive split trunk. He arrived at dawn, exhausted and nervous, uncertain whether Malachi would actually appear or whether his cousin had been captured or killed somewhere during his own journey north. He waited 3 days, surviving on fish caught from the creek and sleeping in a hollow beneath the cypress roots. Each morning he woke expecting slave catchers. Each night he lay awake listening for dogs. On the 3rd afternoon he heard footsteps approaching, and his hand moved instinctively to the knife he carried constantly. Malachi emerged from the tree line, looking thinner than Jonas remembered, but very much alive, his face breaking into a rare smile when he saw his cousin sitting beneath the cypress. They embraced without words, two men who had somehow survived impossible odds, who had each thought the other might be dead, who had carried the weight of their shared action across hundreds of miles and months of constant danger. "Philadelphia?" Jonas asked when they finally separated. "Philadelphia," Malachi confirmed. "There are people there who help. Work available for skilled metal workers. It's not freedom, not really, but it's better than what we left." They began walking north together, no longer separated by necessity, both understanding that the journey was not finished, but that they had at least survived long enough to continue it. Behind them, somewhere in the distance, Ravenshade Plantation continued its slow decay, its mill ruins standing as testament to the night when two men had decided that justice mattered more than survival. The wheel they turned had ground Edward Sinclair into dust, but it had also ground something else, the illusion that cruelty could exist forever without consequence, that human beings could be treated as property without eventually asserting their humanity through whatever means available. Charleston society would debate the events at Ravenshade for years. Some called Malachi and Jonas murderers, criminals who deserved the harshest punishment. Others, speaking only in whispers, called them something else, agents of a justice that laws refused to provide, men who had reminded the world that slaves were human beings capable of resistance, that every system of oppression eventually produces the forces of its own destruction. The cousins themselves did not speak of philosophy or justice as they walked toward Philadelphia. They spoke of practical matters, where to find food, how to avoid roads where slave catchers might patrol, which towns offered safety and which did not. They had turned the wheel and escaped its grinding, but they knew that survival required constant vigilance, that true freedom would not exist until the entire system that had created Ravenshade was destroyed. That destruction would take another 22 years, and a war that would kill more Americans than any conflict before or since. But on that November morning in 1843, walking through Virginia forests toward an uncertain future, Malachi and Jonas carried with them a truth that would echo through the decades that followed, that some chains are meant to be broken, some fires are meant to be lit, and some wheels must be turned regardless of the cost. They reached Philadelphia on December 3rd, two men scarred by slavery but not broken by it, ready to begin the hard work of building lives in freedom. William Still helped them establish new identities, found them work at Thomas Kent's foundry, connected them with communities that would provide support and protection. They lived quietly, carefully, always aware that slave catchers might still be searching for the two blacksmiths who had murdered their master and escaped into legend. Years later, after the war that ended slavery throughout America, After the Emancipation Proclamation and the Union victory and the constitutional amendments that legally transformed property into citizens, Malachi and Jonas returned to South Carolina. They walked through Charleston's streets as free men, no longer needing forged papers or assumed names. They visited the ruins of Ravenshade Plantation, found the millstone still bearing its carved message, "We turned it once for you." They stood there in silence, remembering Samuel and all the others who had died at Ravenshade, remembering the night they had chosen justice over survival. The wheel was gone, destroyed by fire and time and weather, but the message remained, carved in stone that would outlast memory, outlast the generation that had witnessed it, outlast perhaps even the nation that had permitted the cruelty that necessitated it. "We did it," Jonas said finally, his voice quiet in the afternoon stillness. "We did," Malachi agreed, "but it shouldn't have been necessary. That's what I hope people remember, not that two men killed their master, but that the system created conditions where that became the only available justice." They left Ravenshade that day and never returned. They lived out their lives in Philadelphia, working as respected metal workers, raising families, contributing to communities that had given them refuge. When they died, decades apart, both were buried with honor in black cemeteries, where their headstones identified them simply as freedmen, skilled craftsmen, beloved family members. But in Charleston, in the low country where the Ashley River still flows past former plantation lands, the story of the Cruelest cousins persisted. Some said it was a warning about what happened when slaves forgot their place. Others said it was a testament to human dignity asserting itself against impossible odds. A few understood it as something more complicated, a tragedy born from systemic evil, a moment when oppression produced resistance, a turning of the wheel that ground both oppressor and oppressed into something new. The ruins of Ravenshade's mill eventually became a historical site, preserved as a reminder of slavery's violence and its costs. Tourists visited, reading plaques that explained the events of October 1843 in sanitized language that struggled to convey the horror that had transpired there. School children studied it as history, their textbooks presenting Malachi and Jonas as either villains or heroes, depending on which version of American history their state chose to teach. But the wheel itself was gone, consumed by fire, reclaimed by earth, surviving only in stories and the granite message that persisted long after everyone who had witnessed its turning had died. Some nights, locals still claimed to hear grinding sounds coming from the ruins, though whether that was the wind through broken timbers or something more metaphysical remained a matter of belief rather than evidence. The Cruelest cousins of the plantation had turned the mill on their master, had transformed oppression into action, had carved a truth in stone that would outlast the system that tried to destroy them. They were called murderers by those who benefited from slavery, called heroes by those who suffered under it, called complicated by historians who struggled to fit their story into simple narratives of good and evil. But they called themselves simply what they were, men who had endured until endurance became impossible, who had chosen justice when law provided none, who had turned the wheel that had ground so many others, who had survived to testify that resistance was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Their story ended not with the wheels turning, but with their lives lived in freedom, with families raised and work accomplished and communities built. That was perhaps the truest revenge against Edward Sinclair and everything he represented. Not his death, but their survival, not his suffering, but their eventual flourishing. The wheel of justice had turned once for Samuel, and for all who had suffered at Ravenshade. In turning it, Malachi and Jonas had demonstrated that even the cruelest systems eventually produce their own undoing, that human dignity cannot be permanently suppressed, that some truths are worth dying for and some are worth surviving for, and that the difference between the two is a question each person must answer for themselves in the moment when choice becomes unavoidable.